Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, so thank you to the organizers for having me, and thank you all for being here after lunch. So I'm Andrea Luppi, and as my title suggests, I am interested in mapping a landscape of consciousness. Now, some people might think that that is almost a paradoxical exercise, because how can you map consciousness? Consciousness is ever fleeting, like the flights and perchings of a bird, in the words of William James. So that is akin to wanting to map the clouds. But I am here to argue that we can do away with the magic, and we have seen some of that already. And I'm going to try to convince you that we can do better than magic. But doing away with magic does not mean doing away with mystery. And the mystery I'm going to talk about here is one that has been touched upon already. And that is, our brain has a fixed structure. Across a few minutes, the structure of the brain is not going to change. And yet, we can do all sorts of things and we can think all sorts of thoughts. So how does that variety of mental states, of brain states, arise from the same fixed structure of the brain? That is the mystery that I'm going to try and shed a bit of light on today. And of course, talking about mapping structure and function might sound like a very abstract problem. But actually, that is something that we are all very familiar with, or at least all of those among us who have to commute every day to work. Because you can think of the structure of a city as the set of roads that connect different parts of it. And of course, those are fixed. And we know how fixed they can be and how slow it can be to change the layout of a city. And yet, we also know that the traffic can be very variable, and that if you choose wisely the point in time when you commute, your commute can be very different. So the presence of a road between two cities does not necessarily mean that there is going to be a lot of traffic between them. There can be, but that doesn't need to be. So that is a case where function and structure can vary their relationship. And of course, that is one way that we can look at it in the brain. So if you take different parts of the brain, different regions, as your cities, then you can think of the white matter connections between them that Emmanuel was describing earlier as the roads between them. And then naturally, the interrelationships between the activities of these regions become your measure of traffic. Now you're wondering, we've just been looking at pretty pictures of sand over a metal plate. I've been talking about traffic. I've been talking about brains. And you're here because you want to listen about psychedelics. Now, how do those things relate to each other? Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that we can bring all of those together, and the answer is going to be through math. But bear with me. So the reason I'm showing this here now is that I'm hoping you notice that the patterns of sand as that metal plate was made to vibrate were not random. They were pretty, but they were also systematically related to the frequency of the sound that you were hearing, which was the frequency at which the metal plate was vibrating. Why do we care? We care because that is a case where there is a fixed structure, a metal plate, and different functional configurations taking place over it. And that's starting to sound like the problem we wanted to investigate earlier. And it turns out that this is not only very well understood mathematically, it is also very widely applicable. Because this is the same principle that allows humans to make music by taking the bodies of different instruments and making them vibrate at different frequencies. And interestingly enough, if instead of a metal plate or the body of a guitar, you take the structural connectivity of the human brain, what we call the human connectome, then the kind of pictures that you can get are going to look like this. And I'm hoping that you realize the pretty similarity between these sets of pictures, which is not random, but rather is driven by the same kind of math taking place in both instances. And just delving a little bit more into these connectome harmonics, which is so called because these are harmonic modes, the name of the math, pertaining to the human connectome. You can see here that what they are is large-scale whole brain patterns of activation that each of which comes with a specific spatial frequency. And that will come into play later. So mathematically, this operation, which we call connectome harmonic decomposition, is in principle the same as the Fourier transform. Now, the Fourier transform takes a signal from the time domain and turns it, re-represents it into the domain of temporal frequencies. Connectome harmonic decomposition does the same thing, but in the spatial domain. So it takes a signal from the spatial domain, in this case, a map of regional activations, and turns it into a signal into the domain of spatial frequencies. Now, I am not a mathematician by training. And for those of us who are not native speakers of math, such as myself, then it's helpful, I find, to think in terms of smoothies instead. Now, you can see here these smoothies may have the same ingredients, but from their color, you might infer that the proportion to which each of those ingredients comes into play is rather different. And that is exactly what we do. The same thing, but for brain activity. And when I say we, what I really mean is Selen Atasoy and her collaborators, many of whom are in this room here, who developed this connectome harmonic decomposition framework and applied it to psychedelics. And I did promise that psychedelics were going to come into play at some point, so here they are. Now, what they showed is that these connectome harmonics can produce a signature of the psychedelic state, specifically distinguishing between LSD, in terms of the brain activity transformed into harmonics that it generates, and a placebo. And here you can see that signature. And in particular, you will notice that there is a reduction in the contribution of low-frequency harmonics and an increase in the contribution of the high-frequency harmonics. And the same researchers were also able to show that this signature is not just specific to LSD, but rather to other serotonergic psychedelics as well, namely psilocybin and more recently DMT as well, which all act on the serotonin 2A receptor. And what we were wondering is this signature specific to serotonin 2A receptor agonism, or is it specific to a psychedelic state of mind? And to address that question, what we did was looking at an atypical psychedelic, which is a subanesthetic dose of ketamine. Ketamine acts very differently on the brain than serotonergic psychedelics do, because it is an NMDA receptor antagonist. It doesn't act directly on the serotonin system. Nevertheless, what we found is that just as it creates in the mind psychedelic-like experiences, so it creates in the brain a connectome harmonic signature with those typical increases in the high-frequency connectome harmonics, although differences exist as well. But I am in a cognition and consciousness group, so part of our research interests are in looking at loss of consciousness. And so how can we look at that? Of course, it is by administering anesthesia to healthy volunteers and asking whether the same or a different signature will be observed. And strikingly, what we find is that once you give propofol to people, their connectome harmonic signature does not simply change. It changes in the opposite direction as it does when they are under the effect of psychedelics. That is, increased proportion of low-frequency harmonics and a decreased proportion of the high-frequency harmonics. Exactly the opposite. And I should add that this signature is observed when people lose responsiveness, not just when they have a mild dose of propofol in their bloodstream that makes them drowsy but still responsive. And once the person regains consciousness, then that signature goes back to being the usual one. But we tried to go even one step further because we wanted to see that this is not just specific to one particular way of inducing loss of consciousness, but rather we wanted to see whether it can be claimed to be a generalizable signature of loss of consciousness to core. And the way we did that was comparing two groups of patients with a disorder of consciousness. This is what you see below it, but the important part is that the purple image is not obtained by comparing patients versus healthy controls. It's obtained by comparing two groups of patients. All of them are clinically unresponsive from the behavioral point of view. If the clinician asks them, squeeze my hand, look at me, they will not be able to do that. However, a few of these patients, about 8 of them out of 20, were able to demonstrate in an MRI scanner that they could hear what people were telling them because they could, upon command, imagine playing tennis or imagine navigating around their homes, and the corresponding brain regions, which are very well localized, would show up, just like they would in me or in yourself. So we call these covertly conscious patients, and we compare them with patients who cannot do that. So for all intents and purposes, as best as clinical science can determine, are actually unconscious. And when comparing those two groups of patients, this same signature is what you see, with in particular a great reduction in the proportion of high-frequency harmonics. And so to wrap up, what we can see is that we have one particular signature of the psychedelic state that is obtained from the connectome harmonics, but is not specific to any individual psychedelic substance. Rather, it captures the psychedelic mental state itself. And we see that the opposite signature is obtained when people lose consciousness, whether as a result of anesthesia or as a result of a disorder of consciousness. And this signature is obliterated when people come back and regain their consciousness. So it is specific to consciousness and its loss. And of course, now the question is, if we have the beginnings of a landscape, how are we going to read this map? And one way that we know how to do, because of the mathematics that underpins connectome harmonics, is in terms of structural coupling. So you can think of the low frequency harmonics as indicating that function is tightly coupled to structure. Because remember, harmonics are called connectome harmonics because they come from the connectome, which is the structural wiring of the human brain. And on the other hand, the high frequency harmonics are those that are increasingly decoupled from the structure of the brain. And so what this means is that just as other studies already have indicated, and some of which are own, loss of consciousness corresponds to increased structure-function coupling, and the psychedelic state corresponds to decreased structure-function coupling. But of course, the beauty of this is that you don't have just one number for each person, rather you have an entire repertoire of connectome harmonics, from the most coupled to the least coupled. And that means that what we can get is quantify the richness and the diversity of these harmonics that each person exhibits, and obtain what is a rather striking continuum from loss of consciousness on the one hand to the psychedelic state induced by different substances on the other, which is not present when you compare, for instance, test and retest scans of the same people as they are awake, and is not there when you compare people before they lose consciousness, even if they have a level of drug, of propofol, already in their bloodstream. So it really is specific to loss of consciousness and the psychedelic state at the two ends. And our hope, of course, is that using this framework, we can start to build this landscape of consciousness, this atlas of the clouds of consciousness, if you will, that I've been talking about. Because if we can do that, then maybe with some of the technology and developments that Jakub, for instance, is going to be talking about later, we can hope to move people from a state where they shouldn't be to a better state. And of course, All of this work was done in synergy with very many people, and I am delighted that you're getting to hear from many of them here today. And I wish to express my sincere gratitude to all of them, because it is the combination of all of these people's work that has made possible what you've just heard from me. And of course, I also want to thank my funders, Gates Cambridge, who make it possible for me to be a PhD student. And I'll be happy to take any questions if you have them.
All right, great. We've got another lightning talk from Carl Smith, this time about exploring the phenomenology of the M-hole.
So it should come up in a second.
There we go.
There it is.
Yeah, so the audio was working as you saw.
Oh yeah.
I saw it it's on PC. Was it too loud when?
I think it was. Let's just test it again.
So Carl, I'll give you a 10-minute and a 5-minute warning.
Okay, cool. It's only just one audio thing now, so yeah, totally. I can do it here, actually. Sounds good. All right.
All right, let's get started.
Hi everyone. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about something you might not have heard too much about, which is the analogues of ketamine. So I'm Carl Aidan Smith. I'm also I co-founded the Psychedelic Society, where we're looking at how to create altered states without taking drugs, so mainly using technology. And I'm also co-founder of the London Experimental Psychonautics Club. So the abstract, MXE and other dissociatives are very powerful tools in the exploration of consciousness because of their unique spectrum of properties. And today we're going to explore some of the definitions and the history of MXE specifically, the phenomenology of the whole, and also the afterglow of the whole, and some of the application areas, so therapy, treatment-resistant depression, which I think is actually much more powerful as a tool than ketamine, which I think has got lots of problems. Nootropics, pain management, augmenting breath work, addiction recovery, time management. Then we're going to look at some of the protocols, safety management, and the training techniques. So MXE existed from 2010 to 2014 legally in this country and around the world. If you look up the definition of dissociative, a dissociative is a hallucinogen. But MXE differs very much from ketamine and PCP, as they are developed as general anesthetics. MXE was actually designed for recreational use. It was actually designed by somebody who had phantom limb syndrome. He lost his arm and using ketamine all the time to try and take that pain away, and actually was destroying his bladder. So he invented MXE. So it's got a unique action. It's like 3 drugs in one. So you've got this opiate effect where it eliminates anxiety. You've got this very stimulating MDMA rush, and you've also got the dissociation. So that combination is extremely powerful for therapy, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. So it's originally developed through the use of intelligent drug design. It was very, very popular, one of the most talked about drugs ever. A lot of heroin addicts were using MXE to get off heroin, very effective, almost as effective as Ibogaine. But limited data still exists around its pharmacological properties, metabolism, and the toxicity. So highly advised, if you're ever lucky enough to get hold of any, to use the harm reduction practices, which I'm also going to mention. So yeah, it's a rare example of a drug being banned absolutely across the world without an existing medical use. So the big and dandies on blue light are a really good resource for exploring the history. As I said, massive amount of discussion around the substance. And this is actually a really interesting book, multidisciplinary MXE analysis. So in terms of the folklore, I mean, it has gone into folklore because so many people just really, it changed their lives. Some interesting, this guy, Jeremy Kyle, who was actually an ordained minister, he created a church around MXE. And there are various churches that have sprung up across mainly America. The Church of Inner Light was actually developed for DPT, which is a DMT analog. It's very different. It's a very different mechanism for getting to a unity state. So it provides. So it's like you dissolve yourself and everything else comes in. So unlike 5-MeO DMT, where you just become everything instantly, you're kind of doing it in the reverse, but it's extremely powerful nevertheless. So this is some of the stuff coming from the minister. A molecular sacrament, he called it. So you can look at that in the recording. But this is where it starts to get interesting. So there's all sorts of analogs of ketamine. And there's a whole class of drugs within the dissociatives class. So you've got down here at the bottom the stimulants of the dissociatives, things like 3-MeO-PCE and 3-MeO-PCP. Those are your stimulants, far superior to things like cocaine. And I think, if these things were more known about, which is partly why I'm here, people would get off these toxic drugs, which have a very toxic, blood on your hands kind of scenario, politically especially. And then you've got the opiates of the dissociative class, things like 3-HO-PCP, 3-HO-PCE. And then above, you've got the dissociatives of the dissociatives. So things like OPCE, which is currently the best MXC alternative. And then again, they're almost different drugs within the same drug, accessible via different routes of administration. So if you were to drink OPCE as opposed to snort it, you'd have a very wildly different time. It's almost like a different drug. So an alcohol analogy, you can say beer at the top, ketamine is your beer, and then the wine is the MXC and the OPCE, and then at the bottom your spirits are the 3-MeOs, so the much more powerful substances. And again, the protocols for each of those differ widely because of this different strengths. So phenomenology, the K-hole, I don't know how many of you have been in a K-hole, but the phenomenology is quite distinct. So people talk about out-of-body experiences being separated from your body, melting into your surroundings, teleported to other places. Some people enjoy K-holes, some people relate them to near-death experiences. There's a really interesting Vice article where people specifically talk about how K-holes have changed their life. And then you've got DXM. So DXM is actually the first drug my mother gave me at 5. It's a cough medicine, and you may have all been drugged by your parents so they could party. So DXM, there's plateaus. Again, there are whole classes of drugs within the distinct DXM plateaus. So at the first level and second levels, you've got sort of typical ecstasy-like effects. And then in the third plateau, and this is all to do with strength of the dose that you've taken, you're experiencing ketamine-like effects. And in the fourth plateau, you're experiencing PCP-like effects and deliriance. So let's just hear a bit of a testimony of an M-hole.
I'm in, and my mind took over. I was then given a bizarre cosmic tour through the nether regions of my mind. Mystical architecture floating on clouds, strange rooms that I'd never seen before, intense size and space distortions like nothing I'd ever felt before. One minute the entire universe felt like it had been stuffed into a small corner. Next, I was suspended above an infinite void. It's like you're bathing in a warm, radiant, existential glow. Everything can be placed into perspective. You get it when you're in the hole. And the very fact that you exist is reason for a jubilant, joyous celebration of the soul. The whole helps me see how wonderful my sober life is. So what do I do now? Is it okay to go into the hole a lot? What are the dangers? Emotionally, intellectually, physically? I now know how to enter a state of godlike, ecstatic, euphoric bliss anytime I want. I mean, isn't this completely absurd? What does a human being do when he's given this ability? How can I look at life in the same way after experiencing this? I just feel like something is different now. I'm alternately nervous, excited, content, confused, amazed, enlightened, perplexed, scared, hopeful. Enter the dissociative world. If you want to go to heaven, experience nirvana, feel ultimate cosmic bliss, and achieve a rapturous state of being, you can know what it's like to be God, but how will you live with that knowledge?
Okay, some more in terms of the phenomenology. So it's actually fascinating in terms of its extreme euphoria, because it's a dissociative, and you would associate dissociatives with not such extreme euphoria. But as I mentioned, it's a very different pathway for reaching unity. But some of these drugs are like the keys to the kingdom, and I think it's fascinating that these are man-made substances, but yet have profound entheogenic effects. And instead of a come down, which is why I think these could replace things like cocaine and MDMA, is that you actually have an afterglow. So one dose of MXC will leave you with an afterglow of a month long, which means you don't really need to take it more than once a month. So following strict protocols is extremely important. And they're amazing tools for ramping up your imagination and practicing letting go, which I think is also massively important for the psychedelics. People report massively increased synchronicity, and again, lots of things just making sense in your life and being able to meta-program. It also shows the switchboard under which the workings of your depressive mind work, and empowers you to see beyond it. And some of the application areas, so this ability to do very serious self-therapy, specific combinations allow you to sit inside your backstage. So because you don't have any anxiety, you're literally able to have this 360 panoramic view, and you can see all the stuff you're lying to yourself about, but you're able to just sit with it and not judge yourself, which I think is incredibly powerful for therapy. And also for meta-programming, because you have the will. Unlike ketamine, you're very stimulated. So the first thing that happens is you just go up to all those people you've got a blockage with, and you just get shit done. So yeah, it's the true power is the ability to create lasting change. So altered traits. And I think the big problem with ketamine is that it's extremely addictive, and you have to take it very often. And I think that's going to cause a huge problem. These clinics that are springing up everywhere. So there's more money going into ketamine research than all the other psychedelics combined. And I think it's absolutely the wrong way to go. So nootropics, some of these drugs, especially 3-MeO-PCE, incredible nootropic effects. You'll take one dose of that, and then within one day you'll have more insight, more ideation than in your previous 12 months. So incredibly powerful tools, very, very much like you have to take them very, very seriously and be very wary of dosage and redosage. And also, as I mentioned, lots of people, when MXC was on the scene, got off heroin because it was just not as good. Time management, and there's a serious time distortion effects. OPCE incredibly slows time down to such a factor that you could argue that things like transhumanism, which is all about life extension at all costs, is just not necessary, because we can go a hyperhumanist route and actually just slow down the perception of time rather than actual time. So just to finish off, application areas. One of the things that you can do on dissociatives is take a lot of pain. So whether it's a very intense massage that you have to deal with, or standing on a bed of nails, Shakti mat, highly recommended, because you can really sort out your body while standing on a Shakti mat. And normally you can stand on there for about 5 minutes, but on a dissociative you can stand on there for an hour, and you're really seriously helping your body in ways that you wouldn't normally be able to stand. And breath work, you can do very much longer breath holds on dissociatives than you would be able to normally. And also there are effects in lucid dreams that are very similar to what you're experiencing in things like the M-hole. So enhancing your lucid dreaming abilities, crossover between those. So protocols and safety management, hugely important, as I mentioned, but the combination of something like THC with CBD and MXC creates something as powerful as ayahuasca. And I just think that these things should be given the clinical study that they deserve, because they, you know, the kinds of transformative effects that you're experiencing are just mind-blowing. It's also important to remember these are man-made substances, so to take the antidote at the same time as taking the drug. So green tea, very well known for protecting the bladder, and also any anti-inflammatory drugs, you know, things like turmeric, ginger, etc. All taken at the same time really helps some of the toxicity issues. And the training techniques, talking to Chris Timmerman a lot about this, you know, the psychedelic trainings that you can do. I think there's a whole other series of techniques that you can apply to dissociatives. And working with the tolerance. I mean, I think the thing that protects you from dissociatives is the tolerance. It rapidly increases, so you just don't get any effects if you continue to abuse them. So that's sort of baked in, which is really interesting, and I really think that's a good safety mechanism. One of the interesting areas is your ability to bring anything back from the whole. Training in that sense. How do you bring your insights back? And as I mentioned, MXC is the modern day Quaalude. You cannot get it for love or money, but yeah, I think we should be clinically studying it and getting it remanufactured so people can experience the wonders of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. This next talk is our last talk in the second lightning session on psychedelics and consciousness. And it's from Benjamin Bréant. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yeah. Psychedelic compound 5-MeO-DMT induces an altered awake state in mice. I think he actually had a new presentation. Yeah.
Just correcting a few typos, really. Brilliant.
Do you have videos in your
Sorry?
Do you have any videos?
No, I don't.
I'm going to turn down the volume so there's less noise.
Maybe a 10-minute and a 5-minute.
Yeah, all right, cool. Okay, everyone, hi. So I'm Ben Breant, and can you all hear me correctly? Good. Online as well, I suppose. So hi, I'm Ben Breant, and today I'll be talking about how psychedelic compound 5-methoxy-DMT induce an altered wake state in mice. So to give a little bit of background to my research, I am not really interested in how psychedelics work. I'm really interested in vigilant state. So I'll be briefly introducing to you guys what is a vigilant state, but what I'm doing really is just to use psychedelic to try to give a little nudge into brain state and see what it does to try to understand, well, basically, yeah, wake and sleep. So what are vigilant states? Well, yeah, as I said, it's just a fancy name for wake and sleep. And we roughly all know what this is, really. Wake is like when you're just moving around or paying attention to a lecture. Sleep is, well, you can also be in a lecture theater for that. And it's basically when you are immobile, probably. But most importantly, the definition of sleep would be a reversible state of immobility and also low responsiveness to external stimuli. So now what happened in the brain during these states? Do we have markers? Do we have specific things that happened in the brain? Well, to look at that, we can simply plug an electroencephalogram machine and an electromyogram machine to measure respectively the brain activity and the muscle activity. So during wake, this is roughly what happens. So you have these little squiggly lines that shows that the EEG signals are composed of waves of low amplitude and high activity. But also what's really important about wake is you have quite an active EMG. Well, that's normal, the animal is just moving around. And these are two main markers of wake. Now, if we have a little look at sleep, well, it's a little bit more complex, right? We have two substates. You have one here in blue called non-rapid eye movement sleep, non-REM sleep, and in green, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep.
So non-REM sleep is mostly composed of what we call here, and you can see that in the EEG curve, prominent large slow waves of high amplitudes. And as I said, sleep, state of immobility, so no muscle tone. REM sleep, however, is a little bit more complex and a little bit more surprising. We're quite astonished when we decided to pay attention in it in the 1950s. Basically, the brain looks like the wake state, really. It's just little squibbles of low amplitude. But it's mostly composed of a wave we call the theta wave. So no EMG again. This is sleep, so immobility. However, we can see some twitches as well. So if you have dogs and pets, this is the moment where they just start moving around during their sleep. Lowest responsiveness to external stimuli. This is the lowest stage of sleep. We notice rapid eye movement, hence the name. And also, this is the stage of sleep where humans mostly report vivid imagery. So I'm telling you, these signals, these EEG signals, are defined by waves. So what do we mean by that? Well, if we do a little bit of mathematics, we can actually divide the signals in frequency and see how much they are expressed in the EEG. And we have this kind of figures. So here, each colors represent a vigilant state. So you have in red, you have wake, the wake signal, blue non-REM signal, and green REM signals. And I can plot, if I can have the pointer, I can actually show you better. Well, should be there. Yep. You can see here, for example, each of the frequencies are plotted, and here on the y-axis, it's how much they define the EEG signals. So you can see here in the blue line during non-REM sleep, in the frontal derivation of the electroencephalogram, there is a high proportion of slow wave, which is what you see clearly here. And during REM sleep, actually, it's in the theta range where you have a high bump. So that means that these signals are mostly, these states are mostly defined by, the expression of these waves. So we have state-specific markers, state-specific EEG markers. Now, how can we just disturb this vigilant state a little bit? Well, this is the reason why I'm here. Let's use psychedelic to do that. So I am using 5-methoxy-DMT that comes from these little guys over here, very nice chap, Sonoran desert toads, mostly. So what do they do to humans? Well, when given 5-methoxy-DMT, humans report high changes in mystical experience, in mood, positive mood, or in the perception of time and space. And actually, so in this plot, you have the 5-methoxy here in the blue line, and a low dose of 5-methoxy is actually comparable to a high dose of psilocin in this study. So there is something happening there, right? The human wake experience is changed by psychedelic according to these reports. So what does it mean in terms of brains, and what does it mean in terms of vigilant states? And that's something I'm actually looking at. So my main question is, what is the impact of psychedelics on vigilant states? So I'll just divide the question a little bit more. So by that I mean, can 5-methoxy alter the overall sleep architecture? So we'll be looking at if 5-methoxy is wake promoting, or if it delays sleep onset, for example. Or also, are wakefulness, non-REM and REM sleep expressed in the same way after the administration of 5-methoxy? And another layer of question is, does 5-methoxy change state-specific signals? So we'll just be looking at the slow wave activity I've been talking about, and the theta activity as well. All right, so first, let's focus on sleep architecture. So I plotted here in blue non-REM episode sleep onset, non-REM sleep episode onset, sorry, and in green REM sleep episode onset. So in broader terms, that means when the animal falls asleep or when it enters REM sleep. So what we can see here in the vehicle condition, where I just inject my animal with saline, compared to the condition where I inject actual psychedelics to my animals, there is actually no difference to be found between the non-REM sleep onset. So that means globally the animals will fall asleep at roughly the same time. But there was a difference in when the animal entered REM sleep. So what all that means, quite simply, is that even though non-REM sleep onset is untouched, REM sleep is suppressed by 5-methoxy, which is
a very classical response to psychedelic. But what about long-term effect? Is it just something that happens on the spot at the moment I do the injection, or is it something that happens over the course of 24 hours? So I plotted the percent of time spent in each vision state, again, red for wake, blue for non-REM, and green for REM. And you can see that over the course of 24 hours, the animals spend roughly the same time between the two conditions. So you have the classic, the animal starts falling asleep at the beginning of my recordings, so the percent of time spent wake decreases and then increases as soon as the active period of the animal starts again. It's mirrored with non-REM, obviously. When the animal sleeps, spends more time in sleep, that's logical. For REM sleep here, I just enhanced it a little bit because they always spend not a lot of time in REM sleep, and there is not a lot of difference to be found out as well. Just not even a percent difference, actually. So what does that mean is that there is actually no effect on sleep architecture over the course of 24 hours of the injection. So actually the effect on sleep by 5-MeO-DMT is an acute suppression of REM sleep. All right, but then what about what happens in the brain? So when I was asking that question, we decided to focus now exclusively on what was happening in the brain, mostly just after the injection, because we see here that there is not a lot of changes actually happening over the course of 24 hours. So this is roughly the figure I was showing you at the beginning of my presentation, right? So you have here the frequencies at the bottom and how much they are represented in the EEG signals. And 30 minutes after the injection in the frontal EEG, you can see here, that's the vehicle condition in brown. There is a little bit of slow wave activity, but not really, and then a little theta bump, and the expression of the frequency decreases. But for 5-MeO-DMT, I observed that slow wave activity actually increases in the frontal derivation. And it's more striking in the occipital EEG as well, where there is a higher proportion of slow wave activity and actually a complete absence of the theta peak I was observing in the vehicle condition. And what's actually more striking is that an hour after the injection, all of these effects are reverted. I observed exactly the same thing between the two conditions. So 30 minutes after the injection, yeah, frontal slow wave activity and occipital slow wave activity increases, but theta activity decreases. And there was no difference 60 minutes after the injection. So what I'm showing here is that 5-methoxy transiently increases slow wave activity and decreases theta activity. So I'll wrap all of that up in a brief summary. So all of my results show that 5-methoxy doesn't change the quantity of sleep. It doesn't really alter sleep architecture. 5-methoxy's effects stop within the hour following the injection. So it's quite an acute effect. It's not long lasting at all. 5-methoxy increased slow wave activity during wakefulness because the state I was analyzing before, the first half hour was roughly always in wakefulness. And it decreased theta activity during wakefulness as well. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, slow wave activity and theta activity are two state-specific markers. We define non-REM as being a state with marked slow wave activity. And this is what I observed during wake here, actually. So my broad conclusion over this data set is that 5-methoxy injection induced a transient hybrid state of vigilance in mice composed of markers specific to non-REM sleep, the increased slow wave activity, combined with markers of wakefulness, which is a motor activity, because in all of my videos of the recordings, the animals was clearly moving and doing stuff, which is the main definition of wakefulness. So what I'm claiming here is that actually psychedelics such as 5-methoxy change the quality of vigilance states rather than the quantity. So, well, thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to thank my group, obviously, and my sponsors.